Today's ancient witness is from 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 13. Now, concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence and that there is no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Creator, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. However, not all possess this knowledge, but some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will that person not be encouraged, if their conscience is weak, to eat food offered to idols? And so, by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the sister or brother for whom Christ died. Thus, sinning against this person and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes someone relapse, I will never eat meat, lest I make that person stumble.
How many are somewhat familiar with this particular text from Paul's words to the Corinthian church? Some of us are. Some of us aren't. It's fine. It's very contextual within its culture. So it's not an easy one for us to sort out, perhaps. As I preached a couple of times over the past year from this letter, just like those previous times, whenever I think we preach Paul's writings, we have to say, it's complicated. It's complicated for a number of reasons. One is, Paul is a complicated person. He thinks it's hard to get in his mind sometimes. We know this. Paul is both brilliant and says things that have profound and universal application for the life of faith. And he frequently is saying things that clearly are culturally bound, theologically contradictory, and to our ears at least may sound a little bit, egocentric perhaps. So with these challenges named, let's kind of look a little more deeply into the reading this morning. Let's first of all remember, first and foremost, that Paul writes as a pastor. In other words, he writes as one who is concerned for the spiritual functioning and welfare and unity of the local church and the membership therein. Each fledgling community that he was dealing with, as today, had its challenges. The church in Galatia or Ephesus or Philippi, and most of all, the church in Corinth. As we have noted before, the church in Corinth was one of Paul's most challenging communities. Corinth was, as you may have heard in the past, was or maybe some of you have visited there, I suspect, the ruins thereof, was epitome of cosmopolitan, multicultural, commercially oriented, wealthy, Greco-Roman pagan city. A city with many, many gods and goddesses. And a city that was highly, at the same time, as I understand it, materialistic. One might even say hedonistic. Very religious and very worldly at the same time. Somewhat similar in many respects of our own culture. Corinth was a city that knew how to party. It would not be uncommon for a devoted worshiper of Dionysus or Apollo or Aphrodite or Zeus or any combination thereof. Gods and goddesses were somewhat interchangeable for some people to offer, and also certain trade guilds might have their specific god or goddess which they would be more loyal to. It would, be, of course, be common to offer sacrifices to said gods and goddesses, participate in certain rituals, and then with the blessing of the deities, presumably, even as a part of the religious devotion, participate in drunken feasts and orgies. So there is somewhat the context of which Paul is dealing with. And Paul's concern is with the new believers. I don't use this term, baby Christians, but, people are just fledgling, just trying to sort it out, just starting in the faith. So they're just beginning to shift their religious sensibilities from the culture of paganism over to the Jewish sect of Jesus followers, known as Christians later on. In the beginning of chapter 7, preceding this, chapter 8, Paul writes, "Now to deal with the matter you wrote about." And then he talks about a specific question they were wondering about regards to marriage. Again, in chapter 7, on some other component of marriage, whether to stay single or not, again he says, "Now concerning what you wrote about concerning being unmarried." And then shifting over to another church's concerns, of which he had received through a letter, he writes in chapter 8, "Now concerning what you wrote about food offered to idols." Specifically speaking, the topic of graven images and idols may not be directly relevant to, in the same way for most of us, but certainly we can make parallels in our modern time. The larger question of how do we balance, at least this is how it comes to me, how do we balance our various behaviors and lifestyles as it interfaces with the sensibilities of the many social circles we interact with? This can be a relevant conversation, I think, for us. The text challenges us with the question, how does one's behavior affect another person? Does one modify or tone down their behavior around certain people just so they are not uncomfortable or offended? Does one do so for the sake of others out of concern for their well-being and comfort? Or is the issue of not wanting to personally feel uncomfortable yourself or even shamed, even though one knows they really have no logical reason to feel that way? In contextualizing our behavior, how do we not perhaps slide into the trap of hypocrisy or not being true to our more authentic self? Most of us, when we have, as we've gone through adolescence particularly, or as younger adults, or even as older adults, if our parents are still living, we may act or speak differently around our mothers than we would perhaps around our peers. Would that be true? There are certain ways you behave around your mom that you don't otherwise. As parents, we most likely edited our behaviors so as to not be a bad example to our children. Is this hypocrisy? Perhaps. Or is it just discretion? Like with Paul, it's complicated. Even today, we modify our behaviors and language somewhat depending on the context we find ourselves in. I can tell you, for instance, that some of the clergy I have hung out with are sometimes a bit, and I'd be guilty of this too, a bit looser in their language, and they kind of let down their hair a bit more when they are together in their own group than they may be with their congregants on Sunday morning. An occasional colorful word might slip out. Or maybe a more unorthodox or heretical idea might be more freely expressed. And why? Why these circumscribed behaviors in one context and a little more open and free in another? Maybe there's just more acceptance in a smaller group of our peers. We can relate and understand each other differently, and so there's just a less of maybe a formal way of being. Not trying to be all things to all people, perhaps, as Paul later says he tries to do. Or maybe it is. Yeah, that's another sermon. That's another Paul complexity. How do you be all things to all people and still know who you are? Related to this matter of situational behavior, I heard a joke. I guess it could apply to, I think it was applied to Mennonites at the time, but Baptist or what. Anyway, the joke is, why do we always take two Baptists when you go fishing? And the answer is because if you only bring one, he'll drink all your beer. Now, some of you may have got that joke. Some of you may have got, what? I don't get it. So let me explain. So if you just have one teetotal or somebody from their church, for instance, morals, if you will, say don't drink, but you're with another person who doesn't go to that church, and maybe you don't have a problem with sharing a beer with them, but if you have your Baptist brother or sister with you in the boat, then you're going to probably modify your behavior because you don't want to be uncomfortable. You don't want to offend that other person you're with, even though they both maybe would do so alone. We do that. We find ourselves in mixed crowds, say eating out, or maybe, and in such context we might enjoy a nice IPA craft beer, and others we know don't partake of such things, and we don't do it. And so because we're uncomfortable, or because we fear judgment, or we don't want to cause offense, it's just not worth it. We just forego that indulgence and order a Diet Coke. This is the principle that is, I think, somewhat captures the heart of Paul's advice regarding food offered to idols. Don't do it because it's going to make someone else uncomfortable. But that can be problematic. In the context of, which is often, this text is often used in the context of the consumption of alcohol, it might even cause some to stumble. Remember, many of those in Paul's context are converts that are trying to break away from old religious habits, getting away from worshiping idols and pagan debauchery. They were trying to be faithful and keep to the path of their new faith. They don't need to be tempted to think, hey, I guess it really doesn't matter that much what I do. You know, being not practicing, just being a Christian, but not practicing their Christianity. Maybe I think the common analogy I just made with the issue of drinking, for example, might be more apt if we were imbibing in our favorite IPA around someone who we knew was struggling with an alcohol disorder. That, depending on the person and where they are in their recovery, could be cause for stumbling. So you forgo out of courtesy in that situation. These are situational ethics, I guess you could say. You forgo out of solidarity. You forgo out of love. It's not that big of a deal to forgo. because it's being in relationship that is important, and not your right to drink or eat meat sacrificed to idols in the Corinthian context, just because for you there's nothing wrong with it. There are any myriad of scenarios where we might want to curb what for us would otherwise be acceptable behavior around others for whom said behavior might make them feel uncomfortable. I may not eat pork around my Muslim or Jewish friends. I might not eat beef or any meat product around my Hindu friends. Same with some of my vegan friends or friends I know who object to industrial-produced animal products. It's just being sensitive, being polite. It's hospitality. And there are limits. There are ways that this might not be healthy. And I will address those in a minute. Operating out of this principle that Paul is speaking of, out of love, I may want to be modest or circumspect about my, for instance, language around certain people. I might want to be sensitive to subjects that might be triggering to someone's trauma. I might want to be sensitive to people of other faiths when giving public prayers, for instance, and not ending with the words in the name of Jesus. Or I might want to not use our Father as a way of addressing God because, one, it's limiting and anthropocentric, but it's also might alienate certain people to use certain God language. So does this mean that everything has to be scrutinized that we do? Everything has to be contextualized? We have to second guess our behaviors? We have to always be walking on eggshells because we may perchance offend someone or receive their condemnation? Do we hide, for instance, our gay pride flag because someone might be offended? I say no. Do we stay in the closet if we're gay? I say no. Do we put our Harry Potter books away because Aunt Cheryl is coming over and believes them to be of the devil? No. Probably not. Too much of that kind of behavior is perhaps not healthy. And I think we'd agree with that. We have to be true to ourselves, contrary to what, again, Paul tries to do. We can't necessarily be all things to all people. Otherwise, the question might become, then who am I? Where's my identity? And doesn't the world need me to be who I am? Isn't that what God desires? And so for those who take offense where their mental, physical, or spiritual well-being is not at stake, maybe this is a growth opportunity. Maybe this is an opportunity for others to learn tolerance on their part. Maybe this is a chance to exchange ideas and learn from each other. I remember my good friend who he grew up Jewish, has a very open and beautiful spirituality and spirit. He told me once of a conversation he had with his Christian fundamentalist, politically conservative neighbor. The neighbor was going on about some kind of MAGA-like idea with my friend, and when there was a pause, my friend says, I pretty much disagree with most of everything you're saying, but I'll listen to you. And I thought that was a beautiful, non-shame-based, mature way of responding. He stated an I position, yet let the neighbor know that he was respected enough to at least be listened to. I really aspire to be, in many respects, like that, to remain friendly, to listen, and also to be clear about my position without shame or fear. I hate it when however, when I let someone go on and on about something that I find absolutely disagreeable, and yet, because I just want to be polite, I don't say much, and thus leave the impression that I'm in agreement with them, which that doesn't seem helpful either. So here's the bottom line from my personal reading of the scripture lesson this morning. It's kind of simple. Be kind and tolerant to the degree that it is possible and does not compromise your own sense of self. We are all our sisters and brothers' keeper, and if our behavior, be it perfectly moral in and of itself, if those behaviors are cause for another to stumble or to relapse, in the case of the Corinthian context, that relapse would mean to slip back into the old patterns that they are trying to remove themselves from, then don't do it. And whether that is an issue of, we'd call it relapse, or something that shows a lack of sensitivity to someone else's faith, we don't do it. Sometimes out of courtesy, we may have to adjust our behaviors to fit the context and to put love ahead of knowledge. And that's okay. If, however, the situation is one where you feel like the other person can handle it, or you should be able to handle it, which hopefully is most of the time, then I think we can be free to, and I think it's right to, it's more enriching to be our unedited self. One thing I will say about Paul is he is practical in his writings. And as I said at the beginning here, Paul writes as a pastor seeking to assist a fledgling community of faith to be a safe place that is welcoming for the mature and the less mature. He argues the more mature to not, and that's a judgment, to use their freedom in a manner that is insensitive. It's not about being right, it's about being loving. Paul wrestles with the same delicate balance that is not just a challenge for pastors, but all of us, the balance of accommodating a community in relationship to one another. A community, specifically a church community here, where so many people come together at multiple places in their faith journeys. And this is the challenge of being church and community, creating a space where all are nurtured, all are welcome. So may we be able to capture some of the best of that spirit here at CCUCC, where in the UCC tradition we say, no matter where you are on the faith journey, you are welcome here.